Good evening. I'm Jeff Bennett.
And I'm Amna Nawaz. On the NewsHour tonight, floodwaters inundate Vermont in the latest example of extreme weather made worse by climate change.
NATO leaders kick off a multi-nation summit with Ukraine seeking a path to join the expanding alliance.
And sales of non-alcoholic beverages are on the rise as more Americans try to cut back on drinking.
Any bar now worth their salt is giving attention, menu real estate, and I would say honor to cocktails that do not have alcoholic content.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions, and friends of the NewsHour, including Kathy and Paul Anderson, and Camilla and George Smith.
Pediatric surgeon, volunteer, topiary artist, a Raymond James financial advisor tailors advice to help you live your life. Life well planned.
The John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, fostering informed and engaged communities. More at kf.org.
And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. We begin tonight with two major stories here at home and abroad. In Europe, leaders of the NATO alliance are gathered in Lithuania, with Ukraine battling to become a full-fledged member.
And in New England, a storm for the ages has ravaged Vermont. There have been no deaths or injuries, but property damage could reach the tens of millions of dollars. And parts of the state capitol are underwater.
Oh, he's going to get the kayak.
It was a storm that dumped nearly an entire summer's worth of rain in a matter of days. Vermont hit with the same slow-moving storm pattern that devastated parts of New York yesterday as it headed north through New England. By late last night, mountain towns across the state were inundated with up to 9 inches of rainwater. As rivers crested toward record-breaking heights, the violent stream swallowed cars and inched closer and closer to people's homes. Eyewitness video from the town of Jamaica showed furniture and other household items being swept away by the floodwaters.
Good morning, everyone.
Vermont Governor Phil Scott spoke today from the state's Emergency Response Center, shortly after President Biden declared a state of emergency.
I know thousands of Vermonters have lost homes, businesses, and more. The devastation is far-reaching.
Officials have likened this latest downpour to Tropical Storm Irene, which caused destructive flash floods in 2011 and killed 8 people in Vermont. So far, crews have rescued more than 100 people from knee-deep water. And in Montpelier, the state's capital, officials warn that the Wrightsville Dam, just a few miles upstream, is dangerously close to overflowing for the first time. That would unleash even more water throughout the city, home to more than 8,000 residents already swamped.
Oh, I wouldn't trust that road. Ooh.
The floods have also shut down dozens of key routes throughout the state, from winding roads along the spine of the Green Mountains to the main drags of downtown areas. Closures have made access to the damaged areas increasingly difficult. This morning, Governor Scott said on Twitter that the roads around his house were completely impassable, forcing him to use nearby hiking trails for his work commute. At the state's Emergency Response Center, he warned of more flooding to come, despite signs that the rain has started to let up.
Even though the sun may shine later today and tomorrow, we expect more rain later this week, which will have nowhere to go in the oversaturated ground. So I want to be clear, we are not out of the woods.
Now to our other lead story. The NATO Leadership Summit began today with President Biden and allies meeting to discuss Ukraine's security, new defense plans, and a recommitment to unity against Russian aggression. Laura Barone-Lopez begins our coverage from the summit site in Vilnius, Lithuania.
A show of force to open the 74th NATO summit, with the alliance created to defend against Russian aggression agreeing to welcome its 32nd member, Sweden.
President Putin thinks the way he succeeds is to break NATO. Not going to do that.
But unity inside NATO's doors met a call for action outside,
Slava Ukraini!
where President Volodymyr Zelensky delivered a passionate case for Ukraine's entry into the alliance and for stronger security commitments to support the war.
NATO will give Ukraine security. Ukraine will make the alliance stronger.
Allies have agreed a package of 3 elements to bring Ukraine closer to NATO.
NATO's offering fell short of Zelensky's demands. The new communiqué calls for multi-year military and security assistance for the country, a louder voice in NATO via a new NATO-Ukraine Council, and an intention to invite Ukraine to join NATO when the country meets the alliance's conditions. President Biden endorsed the package.
And we agree on the language that we proposed, that you proposed, relative to the future of Ukraine being able to join NATO. And we're looking for a continued united NATO.
But earlier on Tuesday, Zelensky vented frustration on Twitter, writing, "It's unprecedented and absurd when a time frame is not set, neither for the invitation to NATO nor for Ukraine's membership," while at the same time vague wording about conditions is added. For Russia, this means motivation to continue its terror.
There's never been a stronger message from NATO at any time, both when it comes to the political message on the path forward for membership and the concrete support from NATO allies, military support, but also the practical support.
But once in Vilnius, Zelensky balanced disappointment with trust in the alliance.
Today, I started my journey with faith in solutions, with faith in strong partners, with faith in NATO.
Those rifts, present throughout the war, flared up after an 11th-hour deal paved the way for Sweden to join NATO, with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan dropping his objections. President Biden met with Erdogan today after announcing the U.S. would move ahead to transfer F-16 fighter jets to Turkey, a long-awaited victory for Erdogan that White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said was not offered in exchange for Swedish membership.
This is in our national interest. It's in the interest of NATO that Turkey get that capability. He has placed no caveats or conditions on that.
It takes congressional approval, something Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen, who co-led a bipartisan delegation to Vilnius, said is on the table.
We can see something move forward when we see the ratification.
All the while, the war in Ukraine goes on. Overnight, Russian forces attacked Kyiv and Odessa in drone strikes, where Ukrainian forces struck down 26 of the 28 drones. But 1 month into the Ukrainian counteroffensive, efforts to regain territory from Russia move slower than expected, and artillery is running low. Back in Vilnius, Ukraine welcomed a commitment by 11 allied countries to provide fighter jet training. And France announced it would send long-range missiles to the Ukrainian forces.
We have decided to deliver new deep strike missiles to Ukraine. They will therefore be deployed in accordance with the commitments we have made with them.
Ukraine has an ally in the summit's host city, where thousands of blue and yellow flags line the streets, an unmistakable signal of support for President Zelensky, who will meet with President Biden and NATO leaders tomorrow, once again to press his case.
Many at the summit are watching that meeting closely tomorrow between President Biden and President Zelensky, especially as President Biden has refused to back off his position that the conflict must be over before Ukraine can gain full membership to NATO.
Laura, there's so much to talk about here, but let's start with that deal that Turkey is now allowing Sweden to potentially become the 32nd NATO member. What do we know about how that deal came together?
Amna, today, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan spoke to us reporters ahead of the first day, saying there were extensive conversations in the days leading up to this summit between the United States, Turkey, and Sweden, and that the White House repeatedly pressed Turkey to grant that accession for Sweden as quickly as possible. Also, as a part of this, Amna, I was told by a number of senators today who were here on a bipartisan CODEL at the summit that they were pleased that they heard that Greece was involved in those conversations. And they were happy about that because of the fact that Greece had some reservations about these F-16s being transferred over to Turkey and potentially being used in their maritime border dispute.
So, Laura, NATO issued its communique on the status of Ukraine's membership today. Is that any different than what's been promised in the past by the alliance?
So one former ambassador that I spoke to today, Amna, singled out a specific line where in the communique it said that Ukraine's future is in NATO. And they said that that's stronger language than they have seen in the past. That being said, a number of other sources that I spoke to here at the summit said that they were disappointed with what that communique laid out in terms of Ukraine's membership, the fact that it stipulated unspecified conditions that will be applied to Ukraine, despite the fact that the membership action plan requirement, which would require countries seeking membership to NATO to make military and democracy reforms, that requirement was waived for Ukraine, but yet these unspecified conditions were applied. They called it disappointing, puzzling, and potentially a step backward.
So, Laura, when it comes to Ukraine's potential membership in NATO, what are some of the key outstanding issues? What are you tracking?
Amna, at the end of the day, what did not happen for Ukraine was a clear pathway established for when and how they will become a NATO member. Essentially, what is happening is that the core problem has not been addressed, Amna, and that core problem applies to the fact that what does at war mean? And when is the exact moment that Ukraine can become a member? Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, was asked about this specifically today by reporters. What at war means and when the White House would consider that conflict to be at its end and then acceptable for Ukraine to join NATO. And he said that he would not define that at all. And so that was some frustration that I heard from sources as they saw what came out of the summit today.
That is Laura Barone-Lopez reporting for us from the NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania. Laura, thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you.
In the day's other headlines, officials in Fulton County, Georgia, seated a grand jury that could consider criminal charges against former President Trump. It involves efforts to overturn his 2020 election loss. Meanwhile, in Miami, lawyers for Mr. Trump have asked to postpone a federal trial for allegedly hiding classified documents. They're suggesting a delay until after next year's presidential election. The general who could become chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff warned today against blocking promotions. Alabama Republican Senator Tommy Tuberville is holding up hundreds of military promotions to protest paying for troops' travel to have abortions. But Air Force General Charles Brown told his Senate confirmation hearing that it's hurting the armed services.
My concern there is future retention, because we have our more junior officers who now will look up and say, if that's the challenge that I'm going to have to deal with in the future, I'm going to balance between my family and serving in a senior position, and we will lose talent.
Senator Tuberville also faced new criticism for refusing again to condemn white nationalists. But after defending his position for much of the day, he said later that, quote, white nationalists are racists. Medical giant HCA Healthcare reported today that hackers may have stolen personal information on some 11 million patients. The announcement came after samples of the data, including patient names and contact details, were posted online for sale. The hack could rank as one of the largest ever. In Israel, thousands of protesters staged a new day of disruption to oppose plans for overhauling the courts. They filled streets and the main international airport after the far-right majority in parliament gave initial approval to the plan. Police fired water cannons, but protesters insisted they won't back down.
We are here to defend our democracy. We came out and we won't go back to our homes until we feel sure that our democracy is defended against this terrible government that is ruled by extremists and fanatics.
Mass protests have flared since Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced plans to give the government more control over judges and court rulings. It comes as he is on trial accused of fraud and taking bribes. Back in this country, one of the Charles Manson cult, Leslie Van Houten, has been paroled in California. She'd spent more than 50 years in prison for the murders of a grocer and his wife in August of 1969. Other Manson followers killed actress Sharon Tate and 4 friends the day before. A federal judge in San Francisco refused today to block Microsoft's takeover of video game giant Activision Blizzard. The Federal Trade Commission wanted a temporary halt to the deal valued at $69 billion. But the judge said, quote, the FTC has not raised serious questions regarding whether the proposed merger is likely to substantially lessen competition. The FTC can still appeal the ruling. The PGA Pro Golf Tour faced congressional scrutiny today over its partnership with the Saudi-owned LIV or LIV Golf League. The deal has brought criticism that the Saudis are using sports to whitewash their human rights record. But at a Senate hearing, PGA officials argue that the Saudi investment of more than $1 billion will ensure the tour's survival.
We did not seek the Saudis. We were in a situation of where we faced a real threat. But
you could go elsewhere for $1 billion, $3 billion, maybe $50 billion, correct?
We could, but if we went down that path, we would end up giving up total control.
The merger has also sparked a federal antitrust investigation. Bank of America will pay more than $250 million in fines and compensation for junk fees and deceptive practices. Today's announcement says the violations included opening accounts without customer consent and double charging on overdraft fees. Hundreds of thousands of consumers were affected. And on Wall Street, stocks nudged higher on the eve of new inflation data. The Dow Jones Industrial Average gained 317 points, or nearly 1%, to close at 34,261. The Nasdaq rose 75 points. The S&P 500 added 29. And a milestone in the restoration of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris today. A crane hoisted giant oak trusses from a barge in the Seine River and placed them atop the medieval landmark. They'll form the framework for the roof that was destroyed by fire back in 2019. The cathedral is expected to reopen in December of 2024. Still to come on the News Hour, students struggle to make up for lost learning during the pandemic. Northwestern University fires its football coach amid allegations of racism and hazing. And our own correspondent, Jane Ferguson, discusses her new memoir about war reporting.
This is the PBS NewsHour from WETA Studios in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
We saw the flooding in New England at the start of tonight's program. Tens of millions of people living in the Southwest, of course, are dealing with extreme weather of a different kind. That part of the country is coping with day after day of triple-digit heat, and the National Weather Service says it's one of the longest heat waves in modern history. That heat is even more dangerous than you might realize. We're going to focus on that with climate journalist and author Jeff Goodell, who's out with a new book on this very subject called The Heat Will Kill You First: Life and Death on a Scorched Planet. Thank you for being with us.
Happy to be here.
Some 54 million Americans are expected to see triple-digit heat this week. And in your book, you liken extreme heat to having the barrel of a gun pointed at you. Explain that.
We talk a lot about heat and about global warming in our world now, and there's this idea that heat is just this sort of gentle thing that, we have to dress differently for or turn the air conditioning on a little bit. I think what we're seeing now is that heat is a very dangerous force, that heat is something that can kill you very quickly. I mean, this book for me came out of that kind of experience when I was walking down the street in Phoenix and it was a 115-degree day and I was not sure I was going to make it to my destination. And heat is a lethal force.
You write about the tragic death in 2021 of a young California family on a hiking trail. 2 healthy parents, their baby, a dog found on a trail minutes from their home. Tell us about that story and what takeaways there are from that.
Well, that was an incredibly tragic story. A family that moved from Silicon Valley into the foothills of the Sierras to get away from the hustle bustle, live more in the woods. They hiked a lot. They went out for a hike early one morning. They had been warned it was going to be a hot day. They hiked down to a river canyon and then around noon started hiking back up and had to hike up this 2-mile switchback where it was very, very sunny and there was no shade because of wildfires the year before. And the next day they were found, the entire family was found dead on the trail. And what's tragic and sad about this is that it really underscores, even for people who are in good shape, even people who are outdoorsy, people who think that they understand heat, don't understand how dangerous it is and how quickly you can get in trouble.
How do we solve for the fact that 3 of the country's most populous states, California, Texas, and Florida, are right now experiencing a punishing heat wave? Lots of people in places that are really hot. And then beyond that, you've got some 15 million people who spend part of their job outside, the so-called sweat economy.
These states have seen a big population growth in recent decades. People like, first of all, people like warmer weather in general. They would rather live in a warmer place than a cooler place. There's the myth of air conditioning that, it'll all be okay because we can just turn the air conditioning on and everything will be fine. And I moved from the sort of relatively cool of the Northeast to Austin. And I moved there because I fell in love with a woman who lived there. And so people move for different kinds of reasons, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that as climate change accelerates, as these heat waves become more and more brutal, it's going to change that equation. And because, it's fine if you are living in your air-conditioned bubble, but millions of people do not live in the air-conditioned bubble. And we can't air condition the wheat fields and the cornfields and all the other living creatures that are not going to be able to be sort of nestled into some, cool spaces. It becomes this sort of weird life in a bubble feeling when you're in a place like Texas.
Well, based on your research, how hot can it get? What should we expect in the years to come?
That is a really good and important and difficult to answer question. We know we can talk about general warming of the planet averages, but what we are seeing now, and what we saw, for example, in the Pacific Northwest in 2021 when there was that extreme heat wave that killed 1,000 people, it got to be 121 degrees in British Columbia. I mean, no climate models predicted that. It was like snow in the Sahara or something like that. So what we're seeing is as we mess with the atmospheric dynamics of the planet by burning fossil fuels, putting more CO2 into the atmosphere, we're changing the dynamics in ways that we can't really say where the next heat wave is going to hit, how brutal it will be, how long it will last. And it's a little bit frightening. In fact, it's more than a little bit frightening. It's very frightening because, could it get to 125 degrees in Texas? No one knows.
Your book is in many ways an urgent warning. What do people fail to grasp about the threats posed by excessive heat? And what do solutions look like?
I think 2 things people don't grasp about it. One is that it can kill you, and it will kill you, and it's predatory. It goes after, heat will kill first people who are vulnerable, who have any kind of heart conditions. Heat puts a lot of strain on your heart, so if you have hyperthermia or any kind of heart problems, taking certain kinds of medication that affect your circulation, you're increasingly vulnerable to heat. And the other thing that people don't get about heat is that it is the primary driver of all of these changes that we're seeing on our planet. The wildfires, sea level rise, drought, all that stuff is happening because it's getting hotter and hotter. And so heat is this sort of fundamental force that is shaping our world in ways that we don't really understand. And what we can do about it, very first thing we need to do is cut fossil fuel emissions quickly because our planet is warming up because we're putting more fossil fuel into the atmosphere. Second, we need to get smart about the risks of heat. We have to, whether it's by reading my book, Googling, reading somebody else's book, whatever your method is, understanding the risks of heat. And third, we need to change how we build cities and how we live in cities, because cities are much hotter than the rural areas around them. So everything from opening cooling centers to planting more street trees to thinking differently about how buildings are built so they're not so dependent upon air conditioning. We really have to rethink how we live.
Jeff Goodell, the book is The Heat Will Kill You First: Life and Death on a Scorched Planet. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Billions of dollars were funneled to school districts across the United States to help them make up for learning loss from the pandemic. But new research shows that even with that extra money, school districts are still struggling to close the gaps in reading, writing, and math that grew during the pandemic. Stephanie Tsai has more on these findings and where we go from here.
Amna, this research analyzed data from more than 6.5 million public school students in 3rd through 8th grades, comparing their academic gains from 2022 to 2023 with pre-pandemic years. The study authors estimate that most students would need, on average, an additional 4.5 months of math instruction and 4 months of reading instruction to catch up. I'm joined now by Karen Lewis, director of the Center for School and Student Progress and a lead researcher at NWEA, the organization that came out with this new study. Karen, thank you so much for joining the NewsHour. We know from previous, even recent research that public schools are having a tough time closing that learning gap that occurred during the pandemic. How does your study add to what we already know?
I think what's new about what we've learned in this most recent release of data is that up until this point, we had seen some positive signs that we were starting to have some progress towards recovery, albeit modest progress. So it's disheartening and disappointing that at the end of the 22-23 school year, we actually have backslid slightly, and the gaps between current achievement levels relative to pre-pandemic trends actually widened. And that's because students were making gains this year at below average rates.
One of the startling statistics in your analysis is you say the average 8th grader needs more than 9 months to catch up in math. That's a whole academic year. So what should schools be doing that they haven't been to make this happen?
I don't think it's necessarily that schools need to be doing things they haven't been. They just need to be doing more of what they are doing. What we're seeing here are levels of unfinished learning that will take many years to recoup. This isn't a strategy where we have one single silver bullet that's going to get us out of this mess. And it's going to be a matter of layering interventions that are evidence-based and being able to provide those in a longer time frame.
What kind of interventions are we talking about? And have those interventions been affected by the staffing shortages at schools that we've been reporting on since the pandemic?
The interventions all share in common that they're trying to add back in some of that instruction that was lost during the initial phase of the pandemic when schools shut down. So these are strategies like summer school or double dosing core instruction in reading and math. We also know that high dosage tutoring is a popular intervention that's happening right now. And all of those strategies rely on humans to deliver them. So you're right that staffing shortages really impede our ability to deliver these at scale. We also know that any one single intervention is not going to be enough to get kids where we want them to be. And it's a matter of layering these and coming up with a suite of resources to support kids.
Reading through your policy recommendations, you do use this phrase, high dosage tutoring. How do you scale that? I mean, are there any innovations or ideas for how to do that, given that so many students need this extra help?
I think it's time to get really creative about how we're finding access to tutors. And it's not just putting out a help wanted ad, but really getting creative and going and seeking out members of the community that may be underlooked in their ability to help support these efforts. So using high school students to connect with elementary school students, using college students to connect with high school students, and so forth. I think we need to think more broadly and more creatively about how to source those positions.
Some are saying that the federal government, they're pointing out that the federal government put billions of dollars to help schools recover from the pandemic, and that part of that focus was to get students back up to speed to pre-pandemic achievement. Does some accountability lie with how school districts spent that money, in your view?
In my view, it's too soon to really see those efforts pay off. We know schools had a really challenging year, and 21-22 and 22-23 was still complete with challenges in terms of staffing and chronic absentee levels. It's not as if schools are doing the wrong things. They're just not doing enough of the right things. And I think we need to have some empathy for what it's like on the ground. Districts are not set up to be nimble and on the turn of a dime, be able to implement a high dosage tutoring program to thousands of students. It just isn't the way schooling works. I think what our data suggest is that schools are doing the right things, but just not enough of them. And it's going to need to extend for a longer time frame. And so it certainly is not the time to withdraw federal supports. If anything, it's time to double down and make sure that we are supporting schools so that they can sustain and ramp up these efforts in the coming years.
You know, I was looking at a report about how globally students around the world have fallen behind, and the U.S. is actually not as bad as other countries. And one question I have is whether the goalposts have moved for everyone or need to move. Is it realistic at this point for educators and parents to expect that their children will catch up to the achievement that we were seeing pre-pandemic?
That's a question that I get a lot. Why do we continue to compare current achievement levels to pre-pandemic trends? Should we just accept that this is our new normal? I don't accept that this is our new normal. I hope others don't, because if we do that, if we just shrug our shoulders and accept that kids are this much farther behind than they used to be, that's problematic for the average kid, but it's catastrophic for the kids that have been hardest hit, which are students in high poverty areas, Black and Hispanic students, who are fully months and months behind where we would want them to be. And that would only catch them up to pre-COVID levels of inequality. And I don't think we can just shrug our shoulders and accept that this is how things are.
Can't give up on this. Karen Lewis, thank you so much for sharing these insights with us.
Thank you for having me.
U.S. beer sales traditionally peak in the summer months between Memorial Day and Labor Day, but what's in those beers is changing. While non-alcoholic beer, wine, and cocktails make up a small fraction of the overall alcohol market, sales are rapidly rising. We sent Paul Salmon out for a taste test.
In New Haven, Connecticut, paying homage to the Hemingway Daiquiri
with grapefruit and maraschino liqueur.
A Caribbean-style gin buck.
Usually gin, lime juice, and ginger beer.
A tiki punch.
I base it off of this honeybush and banana tea.
Oh, that's delicious. These are all concoctions of award-winning bartender, restaurant consultant, and writer Khalid Williams. Cocktails with barely a trace of alcohol.
My goal is to give you a drink that has, like a wine, a beginning, a kind of mid-palate, and a finish.
Any drink, like these spirits Williams uses, can be labeled non-alcoholic if they have no more than 0.5% of alcohol. And these so-called sober cocktails, he says, are all the rage.
Any bar now worth their salt is giving attention, menu real estate, and I would say honor to cocktails that do not have alcoholic content.
Of course, old-timers like Kevin Nesbitt, who asked if the bar at which he drank martinis 30-some years ago was open at 10 a.m.
Never thought about ordering a non-alcoholic martini, to be honest.
But more and more of us, and particularly younger people, are opting to cut back on booze. Sales of so-called non-alcoholic spirits, beer, and wine at grocery, convenience, liquor stores and the like are up more than 40% in just the last 2 years. There are even bars like Hecket in Manhattan's East Village, which displays, says New Yorker writer John Seabrook,
all these bottles of liquor that look like rum and whiskey and tequila, and they're all non-alcoholic.
Indeed, it's not just the 1 in 4 Americans who don't drink at all, says analyst Kaylee Theriault.
What we see in our data is that 4 in 5 consumers of non-alcohol beer, wine, and spirits are also purchasing alcohol-containing beer, wine, and spirits.
No surprise that the main adult non-alcoholic beverage, again 0.5% of alcohol or less, is beer. One brewer of it, Athletic, in Milford, Connecticut, growing like crazy.
In 2018, we had brewed 800 barrels of beer, and last year we produced over 170,000 barrels of beer. The non-alcoholic beer category itself is growing 30% year over year. We're growing at about 90% year over year to date.
In fact, last year, Athletic had to move to this 150,000 square foot facility after reinforcing part of the floor to support new tanks that hold up to 25,000 gallons for brewing in the boilers, pasteurizing to counter microbes that alcohol would otherwise slay, and packaging at a breakneck pace.
This new canning line right here can do 450 cans a minute.
Brewer John Walker migrated from the alcohol-dependent craft beer industry because of a void.
Nobody had really innovated in non-alcoholic beer for decades.
The innovation, killing the alcohol without killing the taste, found a fast-growing and loyal fan base.
Wow, here's a non-alcoholic IPA.
John Seabrook wrote about his discovery after swearing off alcohol 7 years ago. Were you a problem drinker? Is that it?
Yeah, I was, let's say I got a credible ultimatum from my wife. And when you stop drinking alcohol, you really do need to find something to hold in your hand.
Which led him to super low alcohol beers, but
they were like made in America versions of European beers like Klosthaler.
Until he tried Athletic, which I figured I should try as well.
Okay, well, that's the yellow one. That's okay, too. But when you get there tomorrow, definitely get the blue one.
Which, in the interests of investigative journalism, I did the next day at Athletic.
So we've got some tropical notes, citrus notes.
Nuances mostly lost on my peasant palate. Well, it's nice and cool. It's refreshing. But the key to Athletic and sober beer's success in general was hard to miss. They're better for you.
Beautiful day, huh?
So healthy that the German Olympic ski team trains on non-alcoholic beer. Maybe because it's also low-cal.
This is our 25-calorie, 5 grams of carb, and 0 sugar light beer.
Because there's next to no alcohol. That's why it's Athletic.
A lot of what we did early on was break non-alcoholic beer out of the penalty box.
Bartender Khalid Williams says he too is trying to remove the sometimes negative aura around the sober drink.
It just was not respected, whether it was somebody with child or somebody on a diet, the table would laugh.
Really? I mean, you
For
saw
sure,
that?
many times.
So he's reframing booze-free.
I'm kind of a one-man movement to stop using the word virgin to describe beverages.
So how about mocktail?
I've been kind of thinking past mocktail. How do we get to the point where we're not deleting something, where we're not taking something away, we're making something complete?
Right, so that it has its own standing and no stigma.
Bingo, no stigma.
No stigma for the 1/3 of Americans aiming to drink less alcohol, either to cut calories and or intoxication. And for John Seabrook, Athletic with so little alcohol helped him off anything stronger.
I needed a sort of a substitute beverage that wasn't alcohol, but tasted enough like alcohol that I felt at part of the ritual.
But for some, drinking anything like or even just a little alcohol can be a problem, says Yale psychologist and neuroscientist Regina Sinha.
Recovery is different for different people. Drinking drinks that look like an alcoholic drink can be a trigger. It can be what we call cue-inducing.
And notes the World Health Organization, quote, there is no safe amount that does not affect health.
The short-term effects are sleep, attention and focus, emotional reactivity.
But I'm not alone in drinking alcohol to chill out, right?
Yes, it does seem to decrease anxiety in the moment as you're drinking. For some people, it makes them more social. But very quickly, you get tolerant to the anxiety effects. And the more you drink, the more anxiety-provoking alcohol can be. So the more distressing it can be.
So I'm 78. Should I not be drinking any alcohol at all?
At your age, not a good idea to continue.
Do you drink at all?
I do. Anywhere between 2 or 3 drinks a week. But I have been actually thinking maybe I need to even cut that back.
And after hearing all that, plus a day of cocktails and beer with no after effects at all, I'm on the wagon. For now. And for the PBS NewsHour in Milford, Connecticut, Paul Salman.
Northwestern University yesterday fired longtime head football coach Pat Fitzgerald after an investigation found hazing was widespread on the team, including instances of forced sexual acts. The university received an anonymous complaint from a former player last November and launched an independent investigation run by the former Illinois Inspector General. It found most players participated in or were aware of hazing in the football program. The student newspaper, the Daily Northwestern, also reported that several former players alleged there were racist comments and attacks by the coaching staff as well. Fitzgerald has said he was not aware of any hazing. The school has said it was not aware of any allegations of racism previously. Joining me now is John Greenberg, founding editor and senior columnist at The Athletic. John, thanks for joining us. After that investigation last week, the university president first suspended the coach, Coach Fitzgerald, 2 weeks of unpaid suspension, and within days they decided to fire him. Why is that? What changed?
I think part of it was the public outcry about it. And then quickly the next day, the Daily Northwestern, the school paper there, they had a story with a lot of details from the whistleblower, from a person, an unnamed source, an anonymous player with the university on the football team, who really detailed what the hazing was. Because hazing is a pretty general, vague term, right? It could mean anything. It could mean like, eating something. It could be carrying, bags for someone. This was like pretty detailed and really damning things that were going on there. And they had it verified by another player who verified the initial player's, what he said happened. So that really blew it up. And then you saw more and more stories start to come out from the Daily Northwestern, from ESPN, from The Athletic, just more details coming out. And I think it really made for something they couldn't ignore anymore.
John, the details from the student reporting are really stunning. I just want to share with you a couple of quotes from that former player who came forward. One of them reads, quote, "I've seen it with my own eyes, and it's just absolutely egregious and vile and inhumane behavior." There's another quote that reads, "It's done under this smoke and mirror of, oh, this is team bonding, but no, this is sexual abuse." John, I have to ask you, what did you think when you read these details?
I mean, it was pretty shocking stuff, but also like, if you've gone to college in America, you know what I mean, anywhere around here where there's hazing in fraternities and sororities and teams, like you've seen this stuff before. Some people have experienced this stuff. To me, the story read like they were profiling an out of control fraternity on campus. Like an old school fraternity that had been doing things the same way for 75 years, 50 years. That's what it felt like. It didn't feel like the stuff you would hear from a football team. It just seemed like a lot of really out of control behavior. And even if Pat Fitzgerald said, "Oh, this stuff's happening in the locker room away from me, I didn't know about it." Well, that's almost just as bad because like you're the person in charge. Pat Fitzgerald has been there as the head coach for 17 years, an assistant coach before that, a team captain before that. For him to say he didn't know it, that's pretty egregious lack of leadership.
There's also no more reporting from the student paper about these allegations of racism and a racist culture on the football program. Do we know any more about that?
No, and you've seen some players, some people, especially guys in the NFL, have kind of come out against that, saying, "I never experienced that." And some even said, like, that's not to mean it wasn't true. Some people have said no, but of course I believe it. And nothing would surprise me.
John, it's worth noting, too, the Northwestern baseball team has been in the headlines because of allegations by players and staffers of abusive behavior by their coach, Jim Foster. Is there any sense of growing pressure in terms of accountability higher up? They fired the football coach, but is anyone calling for the president to step down?
Yeah, well, the interesting part about this is the president was just inaugurated last month. So he took over from a longtime president that was very pro the athletic department. He was a booster almost in some ways. So he just took over. So this is a pretty interesting start to his tenure there. The athletic director is also new, and he took over from an athletic director that was pushed out because of issues that had happened in the athletic department when he was a deputy athletic director, assistant athletic director, a guy named Mike Polisky. He's pushed out. They had to hire a guy named Derek Gregg to replace him. So there's a lot of turnover at the athletic department, but there's also a lot of problems. I mean, previously we had heard problems on the cheerleading team. A cheerleader has sued Northwestern for some stuff, and we'd heard of other issues. There's been, just some of the teams there are great, and some of the teams there's been no issues. We've heard nothing about it. But these problems, yeah, I mean, this baseball coach is the first hire of the new athletic director, the first big hire. That is not a really good look for him right now that he hired this person. And, we've heard like there's been kind of a trickling out of things of worries about the baseball coach, and the latest reports seem pretty bad.
Specific to the hazing that the investigation confirmed happened on the football team, what happens now? I mean, this is a huge moneymaker for the university. Could it impact support from the school community, from alumni, from sponsors?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. It was just reported that the athletic director told the assistant coaches and the staff that no one else is going to be fired, which is interesting because you don't know what the other coaches know. I mean, but the way it happened is it being this late with the season starting soon, they've got to find either an interim coach, which I would assume is going to happen for this year, probably from someone on the staff already is going to get promoted. Yeah, there's a lot of problems with the alumni because there's some alumni that are really angry that this happened. And then there's some alumni that are angry that they fired Pat Fitzgerald, who's been there for a long time. For a lot of the former players, especially guys in the NFL, they look at him as a father figure. They're angry about that. So you're going to have a kind of a war almost between the alumni. So that's going to be a big deal. They're trying to get a new $800 million stadium to replace their old stadium now. They built hundreds of millions on new facilities there already. So it's a really interesting, I guess is a good word to say, time in Northwestern athletics.
Certainly a story to keep an eye on. John Greenberg, founding editor and senior columnist at The Athletic. John, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You often see our Jane Ferguson in war zones around the world for the NewsHour, but she's taken some time between assignments to pen a memoir called No Ordinary Assignment, and she recently came into the studio to sit down and discuss her far from ordinary journey. Jane Ferguson, welcome back to the NewsHour.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
So you have spent years telling other people's stories on the front lines of some of the world's worst modern conflicts. This is your story, though. How hard was it to turn the lens back on yourself and tell your own story?
It was surprisingly difficult, especially at the NewsHour. We don't want to be the story. As the storytellers, we absolutely are not used to really talking about ourselves in that regard. Even giving interviews like this, talking about, usually I'm asked about politics, I'm asked about current affairs, talking about deeply personal stories, the story of the storyteller. Mm-hmm. Is new to me, and it really took me a long time to sort of get into the flow of it.
What made you want to do it?
I am asked a lot, why do I do the work that I do?
Yeah.
It's a question that I'm sure you're asked as well. We're all asked this question, especially conflict reporters and war reporters. And I really wanted to dig deep into an honest answer. And the more I try to answer that question honestly, we can talk about what foreign affairs mean to us, how important communication is to us. But those of us who find ourselves on the road and living a life on the road as foreign correspondents, we're much more complex than that, much more multifaceted. And I wanted to write a book not about a journalist and not about a career, but about a person, so people can understand who it is that's actually bringing them the news in the evenings.
And you go all the way back to the beginning of your story. You talk about what it was like growing up in Northern Ireland in the 80s and 90s. How did those early years impact your desire to want to go into this kind of journalism in particular?
When I was growing up, I was in a very rural area. I was trying to make sense of the world as everybody does. I was this very awkward little girl with terrible acne and thick glasses, and I was shy and extremely curious. And I was growing up in the midst of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, so a lot of violence, a lot of political violence, but it was really something that was somehow shrouded in a certain degree of secrecy. I was trying to understand the wider world. And that involved just asking a lot of questions. And I was this very precocious little girl. I was growing up in a relatively patriarchal place where I didn't have a huge amount of professional female role models, but when you turn the TV on in the evening, I saw these women who were telling stories and traveling the world, and lo and behold, men were listening to them, and they commanded people's attention. And so that was fascinating to me. It's also something that I've looked back on in retrospect and seen the uncanny synchronicities of having grown up very, very close to rural IRA strongholds. I've spent so much of my career covering insurgencies, and a lot of that has been a certain degree of fascination and needing to know what causes people to commit acts of violence. Otherwise, civilians, bakers, taxi drivers, farmers, what causes them to rise up? And I, of course, look back now, I realize I've spent a lot of my adult life embedding with, talking to, studying, spending time with insurgencies all over the world.
One of the first on-the-ground wars you cover is the U.S. war in Afghanistan. And there's a story in there that struck me because it spoke to, I think, what we all sort of count on in the field oftentimes, which is just luck. That someone runs into you at the right time, you miss the bombing by a matter of seconds, there's a bombing near your hotel, you're rushing to go cover it, someone stops you and says, wait, you have to wait because there could be a secondary bombing, you're still learning on the job. When you look back at your career, how many of those kinds of close calls were there?
There's probably more than I even know. I often think about that there are the close calls that we know about. There have been a number of incredibly near misses. I write about this in the book when I was in Syria, and I was in the very early days of the conflict, when we were really still calling it a revolution, but it was turning into an armed uprising. And a very small amount of journalists were getting smuggled into Homs city. And I was supposed to go in for around a week. That was the original plan, but I left because I was very well aware that the situation was so unstable, that this rebel enclave that I was in Syria was so vulnerable to attack. I left early, and the next journalist to be brought in was Marie Colvin, who was a much, much more experienced, more senior journalist writing for the Sunday Times of London, and she was killed there. So there have been times again and again where that's happened, again in Afghanistan. I left Afghanistan after the fall of Kabul. Myself and my colleague Eric stayed as long as we could. We stayed for 10 days. And then eventually the one place that we were able to stay was with the British military. They said, listen, we're clearing this out and handing it over to the Taliban tomorrow. You must get on a flight out of here. And we got on a flight out, and every single day we'd been standing at the Abbey Gate reporting for the NewsHour, interviewing Afghans as they were desperately trying to get on evacuation flights. Just a matter of hours after we get on that plane, the bombing goes off at the Abbey Gate. So I still don't know if it's luck or grace or an act of God, but I have been spared many times in my life. I'm very grateful.
In this line of work, you also see up close some of the worst of humanity, people in their absolute worst moments when they've lost everything. And you write about a story in Somalia where you're literally watching a child die before your eyes. And what you wrote there struck me. You said, in those moments where I'm witnessing the profound vulnerability of someone else, I also feel laid bare. People recognize real empathy. It's the only decent behavior in war reporting. How do you hang on to that empathy?
You, first of all, are more aware than you could ever imagine of how blessed your life is. You can never, people ask me, how can you not be jaded or bitter or more pessimistic? How are you such an optimistic person? I actually view it in the opposite direction. How could I not be? I witness people having the worst day of their lives. And first of all, I struggle a little bit with, what's my place here? Am I helping? Do I have a right to be here? There are all sorts of very difficult issues that we contend with as journalists. And so the only thing you can do is be as humble as you can in those moments. And I'm so often in hospital wards with starving children or at funerals, and I'm a stranger there, and all I can do is be as kind and empathetic and respectful as humanly possible.
Do you ever get to a point where you think, okay, that's enough, I can't do this anymore?
I've never thought to myself, I don't ever want to do this again. I don't want to travel anymore. I don't want to do any more reporting, whether it's a crisis or a natural disaster or a war. For me, the thing that keeps me going is covering undercovered stories. And those are only increasing in number. I can see myself pivoting into, covering other things, more international politics or climate change and these sorts of issues, but I don't think I'll ever completely hang up my spurs of what I do.
The book is No Ordinary Assignment. The author is Jane Ferguson. Jane, thank you so much. We're so lucky to have you as part of our NewsHour family.
I'm lucky to be here.
Jane's book is out now, and you can read an excerpt on our website. That's at pbs.org/newshour.
And join us again here tomorrow night when we'll have an interview with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. I'm Jeff Bennett.
And I'm Amna Nawaz. On behalf of the entire NewsHour team, thank you for joining us.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by...
For 25 years, Consumer Cellular has been offering no-contract wireless plans designed to help people do more of what they like. Our U.S.-based customer service team can help find a plan that fits you. To learn more, visit consumercellular.tv.
Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and the advancement of international peace and security at carnegie.org. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.